Hi, everyone. So, as you can see, I'm not in the office today. It's gorgeous outside. A lot of the lectures that I have for you are in PowerPoint so that you can follow along more easily. But sometimes I just wanted to record a lecture like this, where it's just me talking to you the way it might be in a face-to-face class. And if you have a difficult time following what I have to say, most of what I have to say today is going to be in our reading guide. And the same is going to be true for the other face-to-face lectures as well. So let's get started. Last time you watched the videos that I did on the summary for Wieland, and then also briefly looking at some of the historical background, the author's life, and a few other things, right? Next time we have some lectures from Dr. Bernstein, who is an expert in this book, and she has really great insights. And when I watched it, I was like, oh, she says about half of what I would want to say anyway, and probably in a lot fewer words, put it that way. She doesn't go on for quite as long as I might talking about these things. I really like this book. I read it for the first time in college as well, and I am so excited to be able to share it with you guys. So the first thing that I want to say is that I would like you to kind of keep in mind the things I talked about the first week with the American literary movements, and how the driving question for this class is going to be looking at the author in context. So what schools of thought came before, what schools of thought come after, and how are they kind of in this position where they're sometimes reacting to the past, sometimes moving ahead, that tension in between the past and the future as they saw it. For example, with Charlotte Temple, the Age of Reason lasted until about 1815, right? The Age of Enlightenment. And Charlotte Temple was published in 1790. So toward the end of that time, a little bit after the American Revolution. This book was published in 1798, so not that much later. And the thing about Charlotte Temple that we talked about is that they had this idea that the novel was going to corrupt people's brains. And so writers who were just sort of starting to explore this new genre were very concerned with, it is a story, but it's not just for entertainment, right? It has a message. So the Puritan writers wanted writing mostly to be for a moral purpose, for people to come to know God better. And the Enlightenment writers wanted a moral purpose of coming to be a better person, coming together as a nation, having higher political ideals, all of those things, right? And then later we get the Romantic period where the authors are completely reacting against that. And they're very interested in things like strong emotions and motivations for people. So we get a lot of fascinating character development and lots of symbolism and these wild, crazy stories of things that are in faraway places or that happened long ago and things of that nature, sort of like the Gothic stories that I was telling you guys about last time. So Charles Brockden Brown is much less concerned with having a moral than Susanna Rowson was. He does have a message, but his message isn't entirely clear because he kind of wants to leave it up to the mind of the reader, which would have been unusual for that time. There are weird, strange things that happen. There is there are some Gothic elements. There is a little bit of passion, and yet there are also talks about the Enlightenment, talks about rationality, and talks about reason. So I think that what's interesting to me about this book is that it's particularly placed to show kind of a reaction to both the past and some of the thoughts and schools of thought of the future. And he's kind of concerned with the tension there. So watch for Henry Pleyel, who represents some of those Enlightenment ideals, and he is a man of reason. Now, what happens is that there are some strange goings on, and in addition, there is a stranger who comes in, who I'll talk about in a moment. So Carwyn basically tries to seduce Clara, the narrator. And Henry believes himself to be a man of reason, but he also thinks that he knows what he saw and what he heard. So his sensory perception, the thing that he is relying on to give him information. There was a big, this is sort of like I'm sorry, the wind is blowing my hair all over the place, guys. It's a little distracting. Apologies. At any rate, Henry is part of this school of thought that said, we do still, for the most part, people still believed in God, but also the idea of rationality, that I observe things, I form a hypothesis, I come up with an idea of what's happening, and then I test that hypothesis, right? That early scientific method. The idea that what we see and what we hear and what we know, that we can make logical conclusions from that sensory input. Now, the problem is that what he believes he saw and heard is really not what's going on. So watch for the places where, with Pleyel, how does he represent the Enlightenment? And then also, what are the flaws in that thinking? Okay. The other character that the book is named after is Wieland. Wieland is Clara's brother. So Wieland and Henry Pleyel are foil characters. That's when you have two characters who have some contrasting points in their personalities, some kind of a difference that, when shown next to each other, brings that difference out. And Wieland is very religious. So they have these debates, friendly debates at first, and then not so much. They have these friendly debates about how to be a better person. And Wieland believes that you should be moral, that you should be religiously moral, that you should have a zeal and a zest for God. And Pleyel thinks that you should be rational and that you should be more scientifically minded. So what happens with Wieland is that there are also things that he sees and hears that some characters see and hear things, and others aren't there for it. But there are things that he sees and hears that also make him question his senses. And so while with Pleyel, there's this question of what we observe, how can we know it's real? With Wieland, there's also a question of what we believe and what we have faith in, how can we know that's real? So Charles Brockden Brown is kind of questioning both of these things. He's looking at religion and he's saying, look, people have faith, but can that faith go wrong? And can that be twisted? And can they be overzealous and perhaps rely on things that aren't true and they don't know the truth that way? And he's also saying, is reason enough? And can we just rely on our senses and not have faith in people, for example, and just be wholly rational? Or does rationality go too far? And then there are problems there as well. So he's criticizing both schools of thought, which I think is quite interesting. Now, at the same time, these characters are extremely isolated. And there are Gothic elements here that you're going to hear about in the other lectures, so I don't want to talk about them again here. But what I will say is, one of the things that Dr. Bernstein, I don't think, covers as much, many critics look at this book and say, Clara, her brother, Pleyel, and Catherine, Wieland's wife, and then Pleyel is Catherine's brother, right? So these four, and then also Louisa, who's there. These four are quite isolated. They're in the middle of the woods in Pennsylvania. They're on this very large estate, and many critics kind of view them as being symbolically representing the newly formed United States. So that it is a very precarious situation. We're just 20 years after the Revolutionary War, right? And the United States has always been this strange mixture of thoughts and ideas. So because of that, he's showing this family that's seemingly very happy. The four of them having this little society together, and being quite happy just playing music for each other and talking about philosophy and talking about religion. And yet, as soon as there's a new or a foreign influence, everything falls apart. And so his question kind of is, if you think of the United States like a house, right? At Mettingen, this house, how strong is this foundation? And are we at this tipping point where if we get the wrong ideas coming in, and if that upsets the balance, what's going to happen? I don't think it's a fully direct comparison, but I do think that there are hints that that's what's going on. So in the reading guide, I have a little bit more about isolation. I also talk about this idea of a foreign influence. So Carwin, who comes in, he is a stranger, and he's described in various ways throughout the book, sometimes as having French influences, sometimes British, sometimes German. He has friends who are foreign. He looks kind of German, like a vagabond. He calls himself a clown. And yet, we're not sure where he's from. But we do know is the effect that he's having on this very small, happy society. So one of the things that happens is that he attempts to seduce Clara. And I'm not going to tell you exactly what happens there, but I would like you to think about how this is similar to and different from Charlotte Temple. So the role of women in this book is quite interesting. Charles Brockden Brown is obviously a male writer, but he is telling the story from Clara's perspective. And is she an empowered woman? She has money. She has decided to have a small house on the property her parents owned. Wieland and Catherine live in the larger home that her parents used to live in. So she's on their property. She doesn't really need to have a job because she has money. She is very clearly educated. So what happens between her and Carwin, and how does that compare to Charlotte Temple? That's all I'm going to say. How not only in her reactions, but also in the reactions of others once they have hints of what is going on. And at the same time, Clara's narration is quite important. I have questions at the end for you guys in our last discussion about whether or not she's a reliable narrator. I want you to kind of think about that as you're reading. She doesn't even tell us who she is for the first chapter, maybe two. We don't know even that it's a woman telling the story. And there are things that she's describing that seem a little bit implausible. There's also some of her, I don't want to give too much away. I'm thinking about how to word this. There are things that she's concerned with that seem not as important as the horrific events that are going to take place in this book. I'll put it that way. And so why is she concerned with the things that she is concerned about? She's quite anxious about her relationships with Pleyel and then later with Carwin. She seems kind of sexually drawn to Carwin, and yet she also is in love with Pleyel, who may or may not return her feelings. So those stories of romance are kind of intruding into some of the gothic elements and some of the elements of terror and horror and all of that kind of thing. And I sometimes get annoyed with that, I guess, but that's coming from a modern reader, right, who would rather maybe have more terror and horror and not quite so much of some of the anxiety going on. But that's another thing I'd like you to watch for. And that kind of sums everything up. So I really hope that you enjoy this book. I think that, I did forget one thing. I knew I was forgetting something. Sorry. Those of you who are like, oh, good, she's done. And now you're like, oh, no. One of the things that I want to say is that the Gothic tone is set in the very first chapter. It's a little bit confusing the first time you read it if you don't quite know what's going on. I think I mentioned this in the summary, but Clara and Wieland's father, the elder Wieland, becomes taken with this religious mania, and he dies in a spectacular way. It's not really clear if that's by spontaneous combustion, that somehow he just had like a brain fever and literally set himself on fire because he was so religiously zealous, or if somebody perhaps murdered him. That question is never answered, which drives me crazy. I wish that I knew, but I don't. I can't tell you because I don't know. Or if it was some kind of an accident, which it doesn't seem to be. After that, the Gothic themes kind of seem to abate a little bit. They're not there as much when we have just the Society of the Four and Louisa, so I guess the Five. And then the Gothic elements kind of slowly start to come in, and then it builds up toward the climax. So really watch for how the tone is set in the first chapter and some of the themes that I've already talked about reason and religion and the dangers of going too far either way. And then also look for how the Gothic elements in this first part of the book are kind of slowly creeping in and turning this beautiful landscape a little bit darker and more sinister. So that wraps everything up. And yeah, I really do hope that you enjoy the book. I think it is an interesting read just in terms of the story. I think that there are really fascinating thoughts and ideas that are in there, and it really gives us a good view of American history from a totally different perspective. So that's it, everybody, and I will see you next time with our next book. Thanks.